Alright guys, welcome to the last two videos for the year. What we're looking at here is topic 7 in the textbook on biomechanics and skill performance. So we'll break this topic up into two sections. So the first one will be about the basics of biomechanics, and then the second part will be on levers and looking at some balance and equilibrium. So biomechanics, best described as the science of human movement. So the word biomechanics, bio meaning human body, mechanics obviously the way things move. So the science of the way the human body moves. The study of the structure and the function of the body. The investigation of forces that act upon the body. So essentially we're looking at basically physics sides of things. So physics and PE coming together here, but more so investigating the impact of forces upon the body, but also how can we use this understanding of biomechanics to improve skill performance. So number one, optimizing performance. That's why I want to study how the body moves. To correct technique to prevent injury. So there might be an example of someone with their running technique might be putting lots of stress on their hamstrings, and then the athlete requiring lots of rehab for hamstring injury. So changing and studying their biomechanics of running might be able to change the way they run and put less stress on their hamstrings and load up on the glutes more. So just a quick example of how correcting technique in terms of running could prevent injuries. That's all biomechanics. To change the equipment design to maximize performance. Modify and develop equipment to increase participation, especially in junior sport. They're the main ones. Well, and to transfer skills from the practice field to the playing field. Alright, so the first three sub-concepts that we're going to be covering in the basic fundamentals of biomechanics are these three things called forces, motions, and momentum. So whenever we produce a force, either internally or externally placed upon the body, we create a motion. So we create some sort of movement. Now, once a body or something that has mass is in that state of movement or motion, then it has something called momentum. So basically these three sub-concepts underpin everything that we mostly talk about in biomechanics. So looking at forces, obviously forces can be generated internally as well as externally, and also the resulting forces can be internally experienced as well as externally experienced. Usually forces, well in this case in terms of our course, we're going to be looking at forces as either being a push or a pull movement. Motion, which I spoke about briefly before, is about movement essentially. So it can be a person or a body or an object, so part of the body in some sort of movement. Momentum is the mass of an object times by the velocity it's moving at, or the speed that it's moving at. So looking at forces to start with, so we mentioned that the force is a push or a pull that alters or tends to alter the state of motion of a body. So things don't just move on their own, things move as a result of forces. Internal forces, we spoke about that before, occur when the system of bones, muscles, tendons, ligaments act on one another to produce movement or a force resulting from inside the body itself. External forces are more so the forces that are exerted from outside the body. So think of things like gravity or from contact from another person or a body part. Summation of forces. So you might remember this from last year. Often when we produce sports movements such as golf swings and badminton overhead clears, multiple forces are being applied within the body from multiple body parts. So when you play an overhead clear in badminton, it's not just the force that you generate at the wrist and your hand in contact with the racket. You get all the amount of forces that are adding up from your feet right through to your hips, right through to your shoulders, and then through your wrist. All those successive movements and all those successive forces that add together essentially contribute to the force that you can put into the shuttle via the racket. That's what we basically describe force summation as. So different small individual forces, usually coming from different body parts, that are added together and processed along the chain to produce successive movements. So it's important to have no braking transfer from one movement to the other. If you just move your feet and you don't transfer it to your hips and you stand front on, it's not going to transfer right through to your shoulders and through your wrists. It's also important that each new movement comes into action when the previous body part reaches its maximum velocity. We're going to look at that in a second. It's also important to move the heavier or stronger parts of the body first and have a firm base of support, so 1 or 2 feet in contact with the ground. The final force and velocity of an object depends on all the forces of the last body part of the body. So if you generate a lot of force through your legs and through your hips, but then don't transfer it through your wrist, and you don't move your wrist as much as what you probably should, then you're not going to get the total amount of force that you generated from your legs and your other body parts. So very simply, breaking it down into a little nice flow chart here, the greatest possible velocity at the moment of release, so the maximum effort, the point at which you're transferring the forces, equals all the body parts that can contribute to desired outcomes should be used, plus all the movements that these body parts coordinated and are sequenced. So all the body parts that are contributing, that should be, so the large muscle groups, whatever they are, plus all the movements being used in some sort of a sequence, in a coordinated sequence. This all leads to the maximum effort and the maximum total force when you're executing your skill. So I mentioned the previous body part, the next body part should move once the previous body part has reached its max velocity. And this is a basic summary of what I'm talking about there. So for a badminton overhead clear, for example, yes, we know that the contact is with the shuttle through the wrist, but it's all the previous movements that have come through the body parts that adds and creates that total force that we want to use and impart on the shuttle. So for example, starting off from the legs, we might use the legs to jump into the air, but more so for us, it's about getting side on. So our legs start to move, they're generating force, and they reach this point where there's a maximum force or a maximum velocity that's been reached. After that point, the force and the velocity starts to drop off. So you can see there's a nice curve in terms of force output. We want to start the next movement once the legs have reached their maximum velocity, so the maximum amount of force that we can transfer from the legs to the hips. So the next movement is going to be from the hips to twist. Okay, the same concept. We start the movement, and then once it reaches the maximum velocity, we want to transfer the forces from the legs and the hips to the trunk. So your core rotates. Same thing here. As that reaches max velocity, your shoulders and your arms rotate. So they rotate rapidly right through to your wrist, and your wrist snaps over, and that's the point at which you want to contact the shuttle somewhere around here. So you can see now by using or by imparting the force from the max velocity at each body part, we're transferring at the top of the mark, the top of the curve, so max force is transferred and added together to create the end desired force. Badminton overhead clear. Same thing again. So have a look at this quick little video here. Let's have a look at Charles Barkley's golf swing in terms of force summation. What do you reckon? So apart from being hilarious, backswing's okay, but then he gets to a point where he doesn't transfer any of the force from his legs and his hips, and he ends up just generating all the force through his wrists at the end. So he doesn't get that amount of force from his legs and hips because he stops. He stops and essentially just flicks it with his wrist at the end. There's no transfer in the force from his lower body to upper body. Again, slow motion. Starts off alright, goes back, starts to move, and then all of a sudden he pauses. He loses all the force transfer that he's got from his legs. He even goes even slower again. Pauses, loses all his force, and all of a sudden he tries to generate his force through his shoulders and his arms and then through his wrists. So not a great example of force summation. Ricky Ponting, thoughts on his force summation here? Okay. So point of contact, what's happened, because he hasn't moved his feet, he hasn't rotated his hips, he's rotated too far, because he hasn't transferred the forces through his feet in a sequential movement, then all of a sudden he's got no force summation through his bat and obviously looks like an uncoordinated movement. Okay, so looking at the two images of the two students here playing with overhead clear. So it's the same guy, player 1, side on, rotates through the shoulder, follows through with the shuttle here. Player 2 is the same guy, but instead of getting side on and rotating and transferring force from his feet through to his trunk, essentially he's just standing front on. There's no force coming from his lower body at all. He's just applying force into the shuttle purely from his shoulders and his wrists. Okay, so you see the concept of force summation. Here he's able to transfer these forces right through his body, and then ultimately when the force is contacting, his shuttle's contacting the racket, the force is a lot higher than here because he hasn't generated and hasn't passed on those forces from his rest of his body. So looking at motion now. Motion requires an object to move. That's essentially what motion is. It can move by a few different things. Movement occurs by changing position in space and time, or a force of some description being applied to the object. So there are 4 main types of motion that we're going to look at in this course. First one is something called linear translatory motion. So what does the word linear mean? Linear means in a straight line. So translatory, you're translating straight across motion, moving in one direction across a linear plane. Angular motion, so angular meaning rotational motion. General combination motion, so a combination of these two things. And projectile motion is the last one we look at. So first type of motion we look at is linear or translatory, so it translates motion where all body parts or all points in a body move in parallel lines that are either straight or which we call rectilinear, or curved, which is what we call curvilinear. So whilst you might be moving in a straight line, that straight line can be either straight, which is what we call rectilinear, or you can still be moving in a straight line, so all body parts or all body points are moving in the same direction at the same time, but that can be a curve. So for example, ski jumping. So yeah, like I said, all parts of a body travel exactly the same distance in the same direction at the same time. So when a force is applied to an object through its center of weight or its center of gravity, the object will move in a straight line. This is what we call a translation or a movement. The weight of the force translates through the object. Now this is important. So this force we're calling here, this applied force that we're talking about here, where the force goes straight through an object, or it's a direct force, this is what we call a concentric force. Okay, so a concentric force means, like in pool, like in the example we spoke about in class, if you hit the pool cue right through the white ball, right through the middle, the ball's going to travel in a straight line. Okay, we'll talk about what happens if you hit the ball off center, but the first one what we're looking at is a force that goes straight through, or a direct force is called a concentric force. So ideally the object will not rotate because you hit it straight through the middle, the force is being applied straight through the middle. So skiing. Skiing is a concentric force. The force is going straight through the body in a straight line, rectilinear. Curvilinear is an example of a ski jumper. So what type of motion are these? Well, it's the same movement here. The ice skate is going straight across in a straight line. All the body parts, all the points of the body are moving across at the same speed in the same direction at the same time. So now we're looking at the example where the type of movement changes or progresses through a different skill. So here on the runway, this is a never-ending runway. Everything's moving in a straight line. It's rectilinear. All body parts are moving in the same time. This one here, however, so an example of a ski jump. So this is the ski jump to start the ramp. So does the movement or the motion change as the movement progresses? What do you think? So same here, but then he hits the jump and not going in a direct straight line anymore, it's more of a curved or rectilinear line, isn't it? So two different ways that linear motion can change or progress as a movement goes past. Second type of motion we're going to look at is angular or rotary motion. So exactly like this picture here, the gymnast is rotating in a circular motion around a fixed point of contact. So angular motion refers to a motion of a body around a fixed point of contact, which I just said. So the axis of rotation can be internal or external. So right now, is the point of axis internal, meaning inside of his body, or is it outside of his body? So the example here is the outside of the body. So for a gymnast on the uneven bars, as they move, they're moving around this point which is actually outside their body. So his hands are touching the bar. He's rotating in a circular motion around that little point in the middle. So it's an external axis. Angular motion is created by applying an unbalanced force to an object. So like we spoke about with the pool cue example. So if you hit a pool ball, the white ball, off center, what's going to happen is the ball's not going to travel in a straight line. It'll spin. It'll change direction. You will be imparting some sort of angular motion on the ball. So if the force applied does not pass directly through the axis of rotation, then it will produce a torque that changes the rotation of the object. So it will start to spin and generate some force in a different direction. So therefore, angular motion to be produced, an eccentric force must be applied. So that's what we mean by eccentric. Concentric means that the force goes straight through the pool ball. Eccentric means you hit it off center and it changes the rotation of the ball. Next type of motion. What motion do you think this is?
Still the same. Just looking under his shoulder. Waiting to see if there's any movement left.
So the race has started. I know it's hard to believe.
Mid-leg can see the
what type of movement do we see?
Plates are created from the lighting,
so we see the cyclist travelling.
Just to keep an eye on him without actually having to turn his head.
2 laps to go.
In a straight line, so straight across the track. There we go. So from straight across, body parts are moving. Yep, his body as a whole is moving in the same direction. So rectilinear.
Picks up the pace.
What else is moving as they cycle? Is there any rotational motion that's going on here? So the feet around the pedals, they're rotating around a point of axis, aren't they? Knees rotating around a point of axis. Hips.
Are up the outside. Gliders go. Oh, it's closer than I thought it was going to be.
So what we see there is a combination, essentially, don't we? We see a combination of everything moving in the same line. Okay, at the same speed, body's moving at the same speed, it's moving in the same line, so rectilinear motion. But now all of a sudden we've got this motion of feet travelling around a point of axis, don't we? Is it an internal or external point of axis? The pedals going around, they're rotating around this point where the crank connects to the body of the bike. So that's definitely an external axis of rotation. So general motion is what we say, it's a combination of linear and angular motions. Cycling is a great example of this, but also you could think of a girl in a wheelchair moving along, so same sort of thing here. She's moving her body in a linear motion, whereas she's actually rotating her hands around the wheel itself, which is an example of angular motion. So good diagram here, you can see that the bike and the rider are moving in a linear motion. But there's all these different angular motions happening which project the motion of the bike rider going forwards. Okay, so a good example of combination or general motion. Last type of motion we're going to look at is projectile motion. So you've always heard of the word projectile before. I won't use the example of how I used to explain that in class, projectile vomiting. But essentially objects that move through the air after being released are considered projectiles. So when you throw something, it's considered a projectile. Your body can be a projectile, but more often we look at projectiles as being baseballs or cricket balls that have been hit, or a javelin that's been thrown by an athlete. So what happens once you throw the projectile? It then follows a path which is affected by a couple of things. Gravity is the main one, so force pulling it down towards the Earth at 9.8 meters per second square. So gravity on Earth, that's the value, that's how much force is being imparted on a javelin or a baseball when you throw it. What would happen if you threw a baseball or a javelin on the moon, for example, where there's a lot less gravity? So yeah, the ball's going to travel a lot further. The projectile's going to travel a lot further because gravity, the force of gravity, the thing that's pulling it back towards the ground, is a lot less. And the other thing we're going to look at is this thing called air resistance. So the other thing that follows or slows down a projectile is this thing called air resistance. So looking at first off factors affecting air resistance. So the larger an object, the greater the surface area affected by air resistance. Makes sense. Air resistance increases with speed. So the faster you move an object, the more air resistance is being imparted on that object itself. The lighter the object, the more it is affected by air resistance. So the lighter the object, the more air resistance will slow it down. So air resistance will increase with speed, so the faster something goes, the more air resistance, and the lighter the object, the more air resistance will affect the motion. The nature of the surface affects the air resistance. So for example, tight clothing versus loose clothing. Air resistance travels over tight clothing versus gets caught up in and slows down a cyclist wearing loose clothing. The angle of the object traveling through the air affects the distance of the travel, obviously. So the spin on an object can also increase air resistance. So a good example here, imagine we're throwing a discus from right to left here. So as we throw the discus, two different techniques of throwing the discus. A, throwing the discus a lot more flat, so it comes out the hand a lot more vertical, whereas throwing it a lot more horizontal in B. You can see there 2, 3, 4 arrows of resistance here, whereas there's only 2 main arrows of resistance hitting it if we throw it more horizontal. So we're producing or representing less surface area here to be affected by wind resistance or air resistance. So which of the two methods would be most useful in throwing the discus as far as you could? Obviously, the one with presenting the less surface area. Alright, so looking at the 3 main factors that affect the horizontal distance of a projectile now. So 3 things that determine or affect how far you're going to be able to throw something or move yourself in the air as a body. First thing is the angle of release. Second thing is the height of release. Third thing is the speed of release. First I'm going to look at is the angle of release. So looking at changing the angle of release will affect the distance traveled by an object. That's pretty self-explanatory. If an object is released and landing at the same level, so it lands at the same level that you throw it at, 45 degrees is the best released angle. So a good example here, vertical distance, horizontal distance. If you throw something 45 degrees, it's going to go the furthest distance. If you throw it up higher, what's that, about 80 degrees? It's going to go up higher, you're going to get more vertical distance, but not going to get as much horizontal distance. So things like javelin, discus, where you want horizontal distance, that's no good. Same with throwing it obviously at a lower degree. So if you're throwing it at 35 degrees, it's not going to get as much vertical distance, definitely not as much horizontal distance. Another graph presenting it here, so angular resistance 45 degrees, distance traveled 10 meters, just over 10.2 meters, compared to throwing something at 40 degrees, 50 degrees, 30 degrees, 60 degrees. So the next thing that's going to affect the distance is also going to be the height of release. So when the release point is higher than the landing point, the optimal angle of release is now less than 45 degrees. So it's due to the additional time spent in the air. So what does that mean? It means that if you're throwing a basketball, for example, here, or a shot put, and you're throwing it from a height above the ground, obviously, the optimal release angle is now less than 45 degrees. So you see here, if we were throwing it from this point here, it would definitely be 45 degrees. But because we're throwing it a bit higher, the optimal release angle now, we don't have to throw it as high anymore. We can put more horizontal force into it because the release landing point is lower from what we're releasing it from. Does that make sense? So essentially, this concept explains why it's an advantage to be a taller basketballer when you're shooting a basketball. So imagine that that's the ring, and you release the ball from exactly the same height as the ring. The optimal release angle is 45 degrees. But if you imagine that you're releasing the basketball from down here, and the ring is up here, so for shorter people, your angle of release needs to go a lot higher, but also it needs to be enough force to get it up and over into the basket itself. So if you're releasing it from here, less force is needed to apply. You can focus more on your accuracy rather than force. But if you're releasing it from lower here, you need to really give it a bit of effort to get it up and then over to get it into the bucket. So you're going to be focusing more on the force rather than being able to focus on the accuracy itself. So yeah, I probably should have showed this as well. So releasing it lower, more force needs to go into the basketball to get it up and high. And it's hard to work out where your accuracy needs to go. Okay, so the last thing we look at in terms of affecting projectile motion is the idea of speed of release. So at the point at which you release, the speed that you release at has got a massive effect on the distance that the projectile is going to travel. So the higher the speed of release, the greater the distance the projectile will carry. More force, more velocity. So the speed of a projectile release is far more important than the height or the angle of release in maximising the distance traveled. So if you think about this idea here, there's a reason why good 100-metre sprinters also make good long jumpers. So whilst 100-metre sprinters might not have the technical ability and training and experience as full-time long jumpers, purely because they can impart more force and speed through the point of release, it allows them to be more successful at it. So, for example, Carl Lewis was a champion athlete during the 1980s and early 90s. He's got a very low angle of release here, so long jumpers would like to go a bit higher, usually go a bit higher. But because his speed of release was far more important or greater than most athletes, he could actually jump further than them. We'll have a look at this case study in class, but basically it's just a good little interactive site showing and exploring this idea of projectile motion at different velocities, heights and angles of release. So have a go at that. We'll click on that in class. Okay, so we looked at forces now and we looked at a bit of motion. Now we're going to look at basically some other key terminology. So we mentioned speed, velocity and acceleration as important terminology here. So you need to know these three things and the subtle differences between these three things for the exam. So number one, everyone knows what speed is. Everyone's heard about it. But what does it actually mean? What does it actually look like in terms of sport? So speed is defined as distance traveled divided by the time taken. Pretty simple. What we're actually measuring here is the time it takes for these guys to run from point A to point B, which is the 100-metre sprint. Now, we all know that they're not going to be travelling at the same speed from point A to point B. Their speed's going to vary, which is what acceleration basically is. But when we're talking about speed, we're essentially looking at speed as an average speed from the duration of the 100-metre sprint here. So the average speed across the race. Velocity is similar to speed, however velocity also incorporates a direction. So therefore velocity measures displacement. So displacement means distance and direction divided by time. Okay, so now it's the same idea. We've got distance and direction divided by time it takes. So for example, if we're looking at a 400-metre running race, we can measure both speed. We can measure the speed, but we can't measure velocity. So why can't we measure velocity in the 400 meters? It's because purely you start and finish at the same point in time. You start at the start line and you actually finish at the start line if you're in the inside lane. Obviously the runners on the outside, we can measure velocity, but for a runner on the inside and for us at school, when we measure us running around the oval, we can't measure velocity of a 400-meter running race. Can we do it for 100 meters, 200 meters? Absolutely, because we're taking in consideration a different starting point and finishing point. So that's what we define as displacement. Not so much important, I suppose, for us in PE here. So, little case study here, calculate the average speed or velocity for the world record holder athletes in the following table. So, let's do the first one together. Hisham El Garouj, 1500 meter race in the Olympics. His world record is 3 minutes 26 seconds. So, what do we need here? We were trying to work out his average speed for the duration of the 3 minutes 26 seconds. So, what do we need to look at? We need to look at this equation here. So distance, how far is he traveling? He's traveling 1500 meters. Pretty simple. So 1500 meters across the top. How long does it take him? Time is 3 minutes 26. Now the only catch we need to work out here is when we measure speed, we result it in meters per second. So what we need to do is convert, the only main thing we need to do is convert 3 minutes 26 seconds into total seconds. And then we can divide 1500 meters by whatever that is to get us our average speed. So what it looks like is 1500 meters divided by 206 seconds equals 7.28 meters per second. So for the duration of the 1500 meter race, Hisham El Garouj is running at an average speed. Okay, so average, not looking at acceleration, deceleration. We're looking at an average speed of 7.28 meters per second. So every second he covers 7.3 meters. Have a look down at Kipchoge. So recently ran a marathon in 2 hours, 1 minute and 39 seconds. So he's run 42,000 meters. He's run it in 7,299 seconds. 5.75 meters he covers at an average every second. So he's going pretty quick. Alright, acceleration is the last thing we're going to look at here, and it's the change in speed over a given time. So speed, when we look at it, velocity, when we look at it, we're looking at an average in terms of speed, whereas we know that's not the case. So Usain Bolt in the 100 meter sprint, he'll start off at a certain speed and then he'll increase and then he'll drop off towards the end of the race. So what we're more interested in is now looking at that change, because that's more relative to being a more exact sort of measurement of speed. So acceleration, the difference is we measure acceleration in meters per second squared. So essentially what we're doing here is measuring a change in velocity over the time taken. So acceleration can be both positive and negative. So positive, we always refer to positive acceleration as acceleration, so a speed changing in terms of increasing, whereas a change in speed decreasing or negatively accelerating is what we call deceleration. Alright, so the following table and website, if you want to have a look at this more, click on this website. It's a really good example of the change in Usain Bolt's world record in 2009 for 100 meter sprint. So note the changes in speed. This is acceleration. So average speed might be, what was it? 10.78 meters per second. That'd be a straight line, wouldn't it? But because we know that he's changing in velocity, so he doesn't start off at that max speed. Obviously it takes him some time to work up to his max velocity and then just drops off towards the end. Okay, so as he starts to reach the 20 meter mark, 24.9 in terms of kilometers per hour, 40 meters, 41 k's per hour, and so on, until he reaches 44.72 k's per hour as a max around the 80 meter mark, and then drops off. So if you think about this, 100 meter races are all about he or she who slows down the least to win the race. So everyone sort of reaches this, well, close to this max velocity or speed. It's the amount that people drop off that determines whether they win or not. Alright, momentum. So everyone's heard of the term momentum, but what actually is momentum? So now that we know that one force applies, forces are applied to a body and we can create motion, once a body or anything that has mass is in motion, it therefore has this thing called momentum. So essentially momentum is the equation of mass times velocity. Now we're going to see mass expressed as its actual value, which is mass in terms of how much space a body occupies in the universe minus the effect of gravity. So mass plus gravity is weight. But if you see mass, you might see it without the effect of gravity, or you might see it with, which is what really we should be calling it as weight. So we'll look at the two different ways that could be expressed times velocity. So the displacement over the time taken. So here, a good example or a good definition: momentum is the quantity of motion of a body and is equal to the product of the body's mass and velocity. So momentum is particularly important in impact sport. So basically, when two bodies are moving and they collide, momentum is being transferred from one body to the other. Now, if you have more momentum and you're like this video here, if you're going through someone who has less momentum, you are going to travel through them. Pretty simple, isn't it? So momentum is used regularly in biomechanics when discussing and explaining collisions. The generation of speed in throwing and striking action. So when two bodies collide, the one that has the most momentum will be the least affected. So I'll let you watch this video in your own time. We'll watch it in class. It goes for 5 minutes. It's a good example of some changes in momentum. Now these guys use an example of mass, which is not taking into consideration weight. So that's why the mass that they talk about is massive compared to so the numbers are massive compared to what you might expect to see in terms of weight, which incorporates obviously gravity. So that's what you'll see there, so don't be alarmed. And we won't look at this case study here. So just finishing off this video, what we're going to look at is connecting the ideas of motion and force together. So now we've talked about motion and forces. Now what happens now, the question is now, how do the two affect each other? So, you know, how much force imparts motion? How much directional force? What happens when you apply force to something? Does something move without force being applied to it? And this is where we're going to look at these ideas of Newton's 3 laws of motion. So you would have heard these before, but how does it actually relate to sports performance? The first law of motion is this thing called the law of inertia. So essentially a body at rest will stay at rest unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. So alternatively, a body in motion will remain in motion unless it's acted upon by another force. So the greater the mass, the greater the force required to change its state of motion, whether that being moving at rest or at rest. So if you think about it here, let's not go into that yet, but if you think about this in terms of taking a penalty kick in soccer, the ball's staying still, isn't it? There's no force acting upon it apart from gravity. Gravity keeps it moving towards the earth. So without gravity, what would happen to the ball? It would just float in the air. So now the ball's staying still, we're going to apply a force onto it. So we're going to kick the ball. That's us applying a force onto the ball. Now that ball travels a distance, doesn't it? Until gravity slows it down and brings it back towards the earth. So, like I said before, if we're on the moon and we kick a soccer ball, there's less gravity imparted on the ball. It's going to travel a lot further because there's not that much gravity force pulling it back towards the surface of the ground. So looking at the picture on the right, does the sumo wrestler have a lot of inertia or a little inertia? So the idea is obviously larger mass, larger inertia. So what does that mean? It means that it takes a larger amount of force that's required to move him and put him into motion, doesn't it? So something with a large inertia, like him, has a large mass, it's going to require a large amount of force required to change his state of motion. So he's going to stay still unless there's another force that equals his inertia or greater to move him from his state of mass, or state of rest. Does that make sense? So for example, in terms of the second law of motion, whoa. So what we're looking at now here is Newton's second law of motion, which is force and acceleration. So the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the amount of force applied and takes place in a direction in which the force is applied to. So that's pretty simple, isn't it? The baseball pitcher, they accelerate the ball at a rate directly proportional to the amount of force applied by the pitcher. So the ball goes as fast as how much force the baseball pitcher throws the ball. So if they don't put much force onto the ball, it doesn't go very far. If they put a lot of force into the ball, it goes pretty fast. Okay? So this is the idea of force and acceleration. You apply a lot of force, you get a lot of acceleration. And it's also important to know that the force applied results in the acceleration taking place in the direction that the force was originally applied. Does that make sense? Third law is looking at this idea of for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So the third law of motion is action-reaction. So think about it in terms of 100-meter sprints. As they're on the blocks, what's happening is the athletes are actually pushing and forcing into those blocks. But what's actually happening is the blocks are exerting force back into their feet. And that's what they do when they get off the blocks. So for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So whenever there's one object exerting a force onto a second object, the second object exerts an equal and opposite force back onto the top one, back to the original imparting force. So this is the idea why we can walk. So when we walk on the surface of the Earth, we're actually imparting some force into the Earth, and that Earth is pushing back into us, which allows us to propel our foot upwards. Pretty simple. So for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Alright, so the three main Newton's laws of motion, you need to know these three things. Very simple, but what's their link to sport? And give some sporting examples to try and help you explain these three things.